Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can also follow me on Twitter, @JamesRosenFNC. The recent Planned Parenthood videos in which employees can be seen discussing the market for fetal tissue and other aspects of what some call the abortion industry have once again returned this perhaps most polarizing of issues to the forefront of American politics, and right as we head into the 2016 cycle. Our visitor to the Foxhole today is the author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation, published in March by William B. Eerdmans Publishing. Charles C. Camosy is an associate professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University in New York. Professor Camosy, welcome to the Foxhole.
My pleasure, James.
How would you characterize yourself along the ideological spectrum?
Well, complicated, I guess, is the right answer. There are people who are right who are liberals. There are people who are right who are conservatives. I think on most issues that are complex, you can't really pick one or the other. And that's where I fall, certainly on this issue, but with most issues. And interestingly, millennials, the next generation, is right along there. Over 50% of millennials refuse to identify as either liberal or conservative.
So you wouldn't regard yourself as an ideologue?
The opposite.
Okay. I have always regarded abortion as outside of war and peace, the quintessential public issue, precisely because I've always seen it as irresolvable. It has always seemed to be one of those issues where, unlike almost anything else, even including war, there is no room for compromise. The generals may ask for X 100,000 troops, and the commander-in-chief may give them X minus 10 or 20,000 troops. Even there's room for compromise. But in the case of abortion, you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. You're well familiar with that perception of the issue.
Yeah, well, historically, if we look at lots of issues that seemed intractable at the time, right, we look back at them now and say, I can't believe we even thought this was a thing, right? So,
like what?
Like slavery, for instance, right? Slavery existed for most of human history. And in the 1860s, we thought, oh my gosh, like this will be here forever. And then 40 years later, 50 years later, it was unthinkable. So I'm only comparing abortion and slavery in that sense, and not in only that sense. But just give us the sense that, hey, this is something we can make progress on. And as I show in the book, there's plenty of things to make progress on.
So you regard the issue of abortion as not irresolvable, as susceptible to compromise?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you even just right now, forget the future, and the future is exciting, but even right now, 73% of Americans want abortion banned past 12 weeks. 73%. That includes tens of millions of liberals. How can we struggle to pass a 20-week ban when 73%, that's a monster majority of Americans, want it banned past 12 weeks? Now you get below 12 weeks, there's a tremendous amount of disagreement. But even that alone, I think, should say, are we really struggling with 20 weeks when 12 weeks is where the American people are at right now?
It sounds, though, to me as though you lean toward the right on the subject of abortion insofar as you think there should be some limits, correct?
Yeah. Although, I mean, I certainly have lots of allies in the conservative movements on this, but I wonder actually if that's the right home for it. So conservatives are the home of small government, staying out of our lives, individual freedom, choice, autonomy. That seems to be pro-choice rhetoric, doesn't it? And I want to try to say, actually, the home might be just as well in a different kind of approach, which says, government has a role in protecting the most vulnerable, even against the individual autonomy, freedom, and choice of the individual.
You are a trained theologian.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you do your training?
I did my doctoral work at Notre Dame.
And as part of that, were you required to produce a doctoral dissertation?
I was.
What was the subject?
It was on how to think about the very sickest newborns, actually, in the neonatal ICU, the NICU, and how to think about the central sort of moral, theological principles of the church in relation to decisions to treat or to not treat them.
How common is it, just from your own experience, perhaps even just at Fordham, or whatever you know about the broader academic world, for somebody to undergo theological training and to receive a degree in that subject matter, but not go into the seminary?
It's increasingly the sort of way that people who are trained as I was, what we do in life. So there are a few still seminaries operating. they're not very full, sadly, in my opinion. And so the professional theologian, and especially the professional moral theologian, most often goes on to be a university professor of some kind, if they're lucky enough to get a job, and I've been lucky enough to get a job. So.
And that's at Fordham in New York.
That's right, that's right.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Charles C. Camosy, Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University in New York, and the author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation, published in March by William B. Eerdmans Publishing. Am I pronouncing correctly the publisher's name?
You have a special skill for pronouncing last names correctly, yeah.
Now, you make reference in Beyond the Abortion Wars to what you call ratings-driven media coverage as a factor somehow in, I guess, shaping perceptions of the issue and electoral outcomes and so forth. Describe for me what you see as this ratings-driven media coverage and how it's impacting the issue.
Well, what could be more boring to see somebody go on a media show and say, you know what, abortion's really complicated. Let me give you both sides, right? And actually both sides are right and both sides are wrong. That doesn't get eyeballs, that doesn't get hits, that doesn't, who wants to tune into that? What people want to tune into, right, is a fight, you know, a mudslinging fight, which is what we've had with abortion over the last 40 years. And that's good for politicians to raise money. It's also good for media, right? You set up, if you want to set up something, a fight that somebody's going to watch, you're not going to get me, right? You're going to get people on the extremes who are going to go at each other and give sort of like sound bites that you can tweet out and have people watch your video.
Red meat.
Exactly.
You mention in the book that both parties profit from the current construct of the abortion discourse. To your eye, is one party profiting more than the other, either politically, by which we may say in an electoral sense, or financially?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about which party might be more profitable in their engagement with this issue. Maybe Democrats, because they hold the line so tightly on this issue. A wide number of pro-choice Republicans exists in Congress. There's a tiny number of pro-life Democrats in Congress, right? And they sort of enforce the pro-choice orthodoxy there with an iron fist. And
you make clear in the book that both parties are fundraising aggressively off of this issue. Again, I'm not sure that we want to equate financial fundraising success with electoral success necessarily. I'm not sure there's a one-to-one ratio there, but might we see that or observe that one party is able to mine this issue for fundraising success more effectively than the other?
I think both, and it depends on the particular election cycle and what's going on in that cycle. I think overall the last 40 years probably Democrats have, but maybe this election cycle Republicans, especially if the 20-week ban fails, which even though I'm working along with others very hard to make sure that doesn't happen, if it does fail, Republicans are going to raise a lot of money and get a lot of ground game in the 2016 election from pro-lifers on this question.
So is it correct to say that you're not just a student or a scholar of this subject, but somehow an activist on it?
Yeah, I would certainly identify as a scholar activist.
Describe the activism part.
Well, I'm on the board of Democrats for Life, for instance, and we are right now working very hard with moderate members of both parties, actually, to try to get the Pain Capable Act passed, and specifically with reference to supporting women who are in difficult situations, including something called perinatal hospice, which helps babies who are have dire diagnoses in utero suffer as little as possible, and also giving women support, right? So right now, we don't have anything approaching like mandatory paid family leave in this country. In fact, I think it's us and Papua New Guinea are the only two countries, developed countries, that doesn't have something like this. And so, and we're also one of only 8 countries, I think, that has abortion on demand past 20 weeks. So we're working very hard to get, I would say, the sort of sanity caucus together and say, can't we just find a way to support both women and babies in this way?
As a scholar of the subject, what is it about the United States that you would say has made us susceptible to sentiment on abortion, whereby we would be one of only 8 states in the world that, for example, engages in the practice past 20 weeks? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Why did this occur here?
Well, historically, it's very odd that our abortion jurisprudence came from the Supreme Court of the United States, right? So it was a judicial decision. most abortion laws throughout the world are the process of legislative developments. So France had a legislative process by which their abortion laws came into existence. The Netherlands did, the UK did, we did not. And so we have this artificial, in my view, sort of ruling from the 70s by 7 unelected men that this is the law of the land. And most other countries that have used an electoral process have had very much more significant restrictions. The average continental European restriction, for instance, is 12 weeks. So you look at that, you say, well, that's liberal Europe. How could liberal Europe be so conservative, quote unquote, on abortion, right? But the fact of the matter is, when you let the people decide rather than 7 unelected men from the 70s, you end up with something like that rather than what we have.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Charles C. Camosy, an associate professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University in New York and the author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation, published in March by William B. Eerdmans Publishing. It is a regular feature of this program that we ask the authors who come on the set to choose a passage of their writing, typically from the book, which we read aloud and then discuss in some depth. You have chosen instead a passage from a recent article that you wrote for theatlantic.com, which appeared in May, if memory serves. And I quote, "The you're either for it or against it approach simply doesn't capture the views of most Americans about abortion. A majority of Americans claim the term pro-choice describes them somewhat or very well, while simultaneously claiming that the term pro-life describes them somewhat or very well. Given this complexity, perhaps it is not surprising to find that 61% of Americans believe that abortion should be broadly legal during the first trimester, while only 27% support the choice during the second. Furthermore, the political maneuvering of the parties has been nothing short of bizarre. It has led Democrats and Republicans to take positions on abortion in line with something that I call the Costanza strategy. Fans of Seinfeld, writes Charles C. Camosy, will remember the hilarious episode where George does the opposite of every instinct he's ever had, and it turns out great for him. On abortion, the two parties also seem to exhibit the opposite of their usual political instincts. Republicans claim to be skeptical of big federal government and push for the autonomy and freedom of individuals to make private decisions, except when it comes to abortion. Democrats, Charles C. Camosy continues, want government's protection for the voiceless and marginalized over and against the autonomy and freedom of those who have power over the vulnerable, except when it comes to abortion. Are those dual majority numbers that you cited for self-identification on this issue, the sort of twin embrace of the terms pro-choice and pro-life that you cite, are they fully equal? In other words, is one group a majority of, say, 70% and the other a majority of 53%, or are they really equal?
It depends on the poll, and it depends on the year. As recently as 3 or 4 years ago, we had record numbers of self-identified pro-lifers. The most recent poll had a pretty high number of pro-choicers. But one of my points in the book, and in that passage you just read, is it's not even clear what someone means when they say they're pro-life or pro-choice, right? Someone could be pro-choice and say, I want abortion. In fact, most people who are pro-choice would say, I want abortion far more restricted than it is right now. Is that person not pro-life? And people who are pro-life, they say, I want these exceptions, like abortion in the case of sexual violence, for instance, which is a radically controversial thing within the pro-life movement. But well over 70% of even pro-lifers, self-identified pro-lifers, want that exception. So I wonder if we need new terms. I'm just not sure the life choice binary is all that helpful.
During the Fox News primetime debate that took place amongst the Republican presidential primary candidates in Cleveland on August 6th, there was some discussion of the various conditions under which there might be an exemption made for abortion. And for example, Senator Rubio was questioned about that, other candidates also. What did you make of the comments we heard from the GOP field in that Fox News debate?
Well, first of all, I thought that was a unbelievably well-constructed debate, and the questions were wonderful. And this was, these were very important questions in my world, and the answers were telling. Senator Rubio's answers, it's not clear what he answered, but I think he tried to say, I'm personally against those exceptions, but I would support laws that have the rape and life exceptions.
He seemed to be indicating that his positions have been misrepresented on that score.
Yeah. and it's not clear his positions with regard to what. So someone, I tell my bioethics students at Fordham, right, what one believes personally and what one supports it as a policy can often be very, very different things. And I think that's the distinction he was going for. Unfortunately, from my perspective anyway, this is going to get read, if he's anywhere close to a viable candidate for the presidency, these words are going to come back to haunt him, and he needs to find a way to talk about this in a much different way, it seems to me.
So you see this as a kind of intra-party GOP wedge issue, the exceptions for rape and the life of the mother.
Absolutely it is.
And in the book you make clear that, as you say, or as you report, 70% of those who identify as pro-life do support exceptions for abortion rights in the case of rape and the life of the mother.
Absolutely, and that's moral theologically, I spend about 100 pages in the book with those two exceptions, right? It's a wildly complex issue. But from a public policy standpoint, any sort of policy is dead on arrival if you don't have those two exceptions. It's simply not viable.
In the research you've done, in the scanning of polling and so on, is anybody making a distinction between the life of the mother and the health of the mother?
Yeah, that's another really, really complex question. And it's tough to answer in 2 seconds or 30 seconds.
You have more than that. You're in the foxhole.
Okay, well let's try to talk about this. So, from a certain perspective, every pregnancy is a threat to the mother's health, right? And so, if you have a health exception, it's not clear that that's just abortion on demand, right? But then you don't want to be, at least from my perspective, you don't want to not pay attention to those very serious health situations that arise, which may or may not be directly threatening the mother's life, and what counts as a direct threat to the mother's life. So would second stage uterine cancer, for instance, be a direct threat to the mother's life? Most people would say yes, even if the percentages of death are fairly small. And in fact, this is widely misinterpreted. I'm Roman Catholic. We have a well-developed teaching on this. Even the Catholic Church would say you can do what's called an indirect abortion in those cases. So you could remove, for instance, the cancerous uterus with the baby inside or something like that. But this is another example of why the difference between morality and public policy is so important to really drive home, because one can say, oh yes, I want a life exception, but I don't want a health exception. Well, how does that work as a matter of law, right? As a policy that wouldn't unduly affect what the policy ends up allowing or not allowing anyway.
Or unduly burden those tasked with making the decision to do so on a case-by-case basis that's very time-consuming and impractical as far as public policy goes.
Yeah, and especially if there is an emergent situation and someone is in intensive care and, right, how do you, I mean, we spend semesters worth of time with these questions and still maybe don't come as close as we'd like to finding a solution.
Is it your conclusion from studying this issue that those who go beyond merely identifying themselves as pro-life, but who go on to identify themselves as those who believe firmly that life begins at conception, are the least susceptible to compromise on the issue?
Yes, I think as a matter of just the practical reality out there, I think that's correct. But many people, including the Catholic Church, would say life begins at conception, but the woman ought to be able to remove a cancerous uterus even if she's pregnant, right? So, so as a matter of just the reality out there, that's correct. But I think if people thought it through, you can say, I think that's a baby, right? But still, I think there should be this exception.
I think that there's a category of people out there in the United States, and I don't pretend to know how large it is or the various demographic groups in which it may be found to reside, but I think that there's a category of people who feel about abortion as follows: that if a woman, having conceived on Thursday night, knows that she is pregnant on Friday morning and may then drink a morning after type cocktail, if you will, that will serve to abort what at that point is simply just an untraceable zygote running around her system, would say that there's no problem with that, but that the moment that the unborn child starts to exhibit vaguely human-like tendencies of little feet and little hands and so forth, they become rather queasy about the prospect of abortion as legal. Is that a fair summary of how a lot of people think about it?
I think it is. I think the more I study ethics, the more I think most of us at our gut levels, our first principles, have a view which is not based on sort of like thinking really hard about it, but just sort of an emotional reaction to something. We call it in our field emotivism, right? But if we think hard enough about that, it seems arbitrary to say that a member of the species Homo sapiens that has, say, a well-developed heart versus a less developed heart, or has big hands versus small hands, or has ears versus not ears, or hair versus not hair, or as my colleague in ethics, Peter Singer at Princeton, says, after birth, these babies are still growing after birth. They don't have self-awareness until well after birth. It seems arbitrary to say that birth, is the dividing line for this. If the argument is that all members of the species Homo sapiens have a right to life, it seems arbitrary to say that at this stage of development they do, or at this stage of development they don't.
In other words, that would validate those who say life begins at conception, that the zygote itself is worthy of protection. If
the argument is, and some people reject this, but if the argument is that all members of the species Homo sapiens have a right to life, then it's just anti-science to say that the zygote does not have a right to life. The zygote is a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, there are those who reject, in part because they're uncomfortable with the position that leads them to, who reject the idea that all members of the species Homo sapiens have a right to life. But that puts them in a very difficult position. In fact, that puts them in the Peter Singer position, right? Like, what are you going to choose? Self-awareness, rationality, those things aren't developed until well after birth.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Charles C. Camosy, Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University in New York, and the author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation, published in March by William B. Eerdmans Publishing. So what is the way forward?
Well, I think it's a way, coming back to the first question you asked, the way forward is to get people of multiple points of view behind this and to not see this as a war, like it's us versus them. Instead, work very hard to get broad-based coalitions together on places where we disagree.
And who are the, what we might, in a way we don't intend to be pejorative, but nonetheless identify as the hard core that won't ever be brought along to the kind of compromise you're talking about? Who is that?
Well, I think it's what I call, in the book, I call the 10% extremes. So we have everyone on the pro-choice side, somebody like Katha Pollitt, who writes a book called Pro, which says abortion is not only, it should be safe, legal, and rare, it's a social good, and we should, go after it as a social good. And then I think you have people on the other side who say no exceptions for anything ever, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's even, in some cases, there are people who would say mothers should die rather than have an abortion. Fortunately, those people are really extreme, and there's a middle 80% where we can actually make up a lot of ground.
Do you identify amongst the presidential candidates anyone who belongs to that latter group that you just described?
Well, in the last presidential election cycle, I would have said Hillary Rodham Clinton would have been in that group.
Which group?
The moderate group. Because she was part of the Clintonian approach, safe, legal, and rare. Let's try to make abortion rare. But if you pay attention to her rhetoric, right, she's dropped the rare part, in part because of pressure from lobbying groups in enforcing pro-choice orthodoxy. I would say Marco Rubio is an interesting example. I think he, despite that answer in the debate, has really been open to this sort of like, let's stop choosing between mother and baby, and let's support women along with supporting children at the same time. If he can pull that off, he not only solidifies himself as a moderate that can sort of be the anti-Trump, sort of like extremist position and say, I can work with Democrats, I can work with the middle ground, and I can actually get elected. And on this issue in particular, refuse to choose between women and their prenatal children.
What did you make of the Planned Parenthood videos?
They're horrific. You can speak as a professor antiseptically about these things, and I focus in bioethics, so I talk about abortion way more than I should because it's what I do in bioethics. But when you see petri dishes full of limbs, right? When you hear clinic workers talk in such dismissive and often almost like they're trying to make jokes in a way, it's horrific. So two important things I think are coming out of this. The euphemisms that we use, like products of conception, tissue, clumps of cells. Even the word fetus is interesting, right? We don't really know, no one talks about a fetus bump, they talk about a baby bump, right? these are all dehumanizing phrases and words we refer to prenatal life with. And the Planned Parenthood videos have really held up a mirror to our culture and said, please stop talking like that. If we're going to talk about abortion, let's at least be honest about what we're talking about. And then the second thing to come out of this, I think, is a sense that we don't need Planned Parenthood. You know, as you can probably tell from this interview, I'm not a conservative. I'm not a liberal. I think government has a role to play in supporting women. Planned Parenthood doesn't need to be the one in that role. We have 10 times the number of Planned Parenthood clinics that exist as community health centers across this country that can do everything Planned Parenthood does, but in a nonviolent way, without abortion. And I think we should be thinking about, instead of just straight up no chaser defunding Planned Parenthood, we should be instead using the rhetoric, which names something important, about reallocating the resources to
these clinics.
To these clinics.
These clinics provide abortion services, though.
They do not. They do not. The community health centers do not. And that's the important part about all this. So Democrats for Life, again, has been working overtime to try to get this message out there, that there are these community health center clinics. They've been funded very strongly by the Affordable Care Act. They could be even more strongly funded. Let's give the $500 million tax dollars we give to Planned Parenthood every year and give it to these community health centers. And in addition to not doing abortions, they provide much more comprehensive care. It's been said that, you know, the classic response I get from people is, well, Planned Parenthood does things like mammograms. Are you against women having mammograms? First of all, they don't do mammograms. Second of all, we are for women having mammograms in nonviolent healthcare centers like these ones that we're pushing for. And too often, I think this gets lost in the small versus big government wars. Pro-lifers ought to be pushing for reallocating these resources to community health centers.
But under the way forward that you prescribe for the new generation, and under the kind of compromise that you prescribe, which involves really, as I understand it, exploiting the one area of overlap between the Venn diagrams here of pro-life and pro-choice, where would somebody who wants to receive an abortion in the first 20 weeks, and which you regard as reasonable, go to do that if all this money were reallocated to these health clinics and there were no Planned Parenthood? Who would provide that service?
Well, Planned Parenthood is the country's largest abortion provider, but they only provide, I don't know the exact number, but about 1/3 of the abortions in this country. So, so number one, there are going to be other places for women to get abortions, which I don't support, but just to answer your question, there would be.
But you do, if this is your compromise, right? It's 20 weeks. That's your compromise.
No, that's what the compromise is in today's political reality. It's working with the Pain Capable Act, which is 20 weeks.
Okay. But it's not your personal view.
It's not my personal view, and even the compromise we propose in the book is far more restrictive than that even. But we need to live in political reality. What we have before us is a 20-week ban. And even if Planned Parenthood were defunded tax-wise, they're not going away as an institution. So in addition to going to the other places where 2/3 of abortions are performed, Planned Parenthood will not go away just simply because they don't have taxpayer money.
Just have about a minute left. Your previous book was entitled Peter Singer and Christian Ethics Beyond Polarization. Who was Peter Singer?
Well, I've mentioned him a couple of times already. He's a very famous Princeton philosopher, and I originally got to know his work because I was so outraged at his pro-infanticide view, or pro-choice for infanticide view, which I've already raised. Okay. But the more that I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what? He and John Paul II are maybe the only two people in the world right now that really understand what's at stake here. It's sort of either a baby is a baby from conception, or we pick another trait, which I call trait X, which means going well after birth. And then I started reading more of his work and about poverty and about animals, and I became convinced that he has a lot more to tell us.
Well, from both titles, we know that you have an instinct for looking beyond things, and we look forward to that continuing. Our visitor to the Foxhole today has been Charles C. Camosy, Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University and author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation, published in March by William B. Eerdmans Publishing. That's going to do it for this episode of the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, signing off from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at James Rosen, FNC, and we will FNC you next time.